Kingdom Polemics exists to equip the church for battle against the kingdom of darkness in light of the particular threats of our day. Kingdom Polemics is about taking the cosmic, Christological concepts of the Scottish Reformed and connecting it to the ground.
This is Kingdom Polemics, and we are continuing the conversation about connecting the dots between the 1640s and the present. And we have somebody to help us do that today. Just to remind you, this person that we have on, Reverend or Pastor Gavin Beers, we had 4 episodes of his content. It was a conference that he did at a church on here on the establishment principle. I don't know how I came across it. I don't remember where I came across it, but somebody pitched it to me. I listened to it and I found it to be very helpful, and so decided to ask if it was appropriate to share here with y'all. And you guys have given a lot of good feedback about it. It's one of the more popular downloaded episodes, and a lot ways back I said, hey, it'd be good for you to just talk live about it, Pastor Gavin. And so here he is talking about that same conversation that was thoroughly unpacked in those 4 episodes. So Gavin, why don't you let folks know just a little bit about yourselves before we get started.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to come on, speak about this topic. As for myself, I'm a native of Northern Ireland. I've been away for a long time. First of all, I was in Scotland as a student and then a minister of the Free Church of Scotland continuing. I was there for 15 years total, 12 years as pastor in a congregation in the southwest in a town called Ayr. And then in 2018, I received a call to one of our church plants in North America. And I've been here in Burlington, North Carolina for the last 5.5 years. We came as a family. I'm married to Alison. We've 6 children ranging from 22 to 13. And they're all becoming increasingly American.
Yeah. Well, that'll happen in the Carolinas for sure. If they were in Miami, they might not happen that fast, because this is not exactly like America.
It's more cosmopolitan.
It's like North Latin America. Some people call it North Cuba. So my wife feels like she's living in another country because she grew up in the DC metro area,
right? And
she doesn't feel at home here. I do, but she's at a place. So yeah, I would love to hear you in different ways unpack this conversation about establishment principle. And a good place to start would be what is it and what is it not? Yeah, what is establishment principle and what is it not? So why don't we just start there?
Well, the term itself, when people hear it initially, doesn't seem to say a lot, but if you focus upon the word establishment, that really gives you the essence of what we're talking about. It's describing fundamentally the relationship between church and state, with an emphasis upon the responsibility of the civil magistrate in relation to religion. And so if you step back and look historically and theologically about the various ideas that have dominated in the relationship between church and state, you would have, say, the Roman Catholic view, and they would tend to view the church as over the state, and hence the Pope's claims to be Prince of the Kings of the earth. And so the church is kind of like a quasi-civil ecclesiastical body in and of itself. So that's the church over the state. And then at the Reformation, there was a big reaction to that, and a number of Protestant denominations would have adopted what we know as Erastianism. And so in that you have the state over the church. So classic example would be what happened in England, where the king, he wanted a divorce and he didn't get what he wanted. And so he cast off Rome and declared himself to be the head of the church. And so the Anglican church has continued with that view where the state is over the church. And then a third view would be what tends to be called voluntarism. And essentially that views the church somewhat as a voluntary society. And it separates in an absolute way church and state so that they're completely independent of one another and not even coordinate, that the state doesn't have any role in religion. But then there's a fourth view, which is the establishment view, which of course I would believe is biblical. And that believes in the independence of church and state. So each has their own independent government, their own lawful and limited jurisdiction. But both the church and the state are to govern in their sphere according to the same law, which is the whole moral law of God. And so the church has to exercise the keys of the kingdom in that way, but the civil magistrate or the civil government, they also have to exercise their God-given authority according to the same law, which means that there is essentially a religious aspect to the state. Not that it can take dominion over the church, not that it can exercise the keys of the kingdom, can't define doctrine, can't exercise church discipline. But it's not to be religiously neutral, and it's to see to it that true religion is promoted and established in its realm, and that the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ is nourished, and consequently idolatry and false religion suppressed.
Yeah. What would you, if someone were to say, where in the Bible do you find reasons for this view? What would be your key exegetical reasons for having this view?
You know, that's a massive question, because once you start to see texts that teach this, all of a sudden the Bible is presenting them everywhere, you know. So even if you step back behind the Bible, there's even an argument from nature, you know, that historically civil governments have recognized that men are religious beings and that they have a duty to promote good. Religion is for the good of a society. And historically, you find many pagan nations with essentially a view of established religion. You find Cicero and people like that speaking in those terms. So there's something fundamental to it, even obvious from the light of nature. But your question is, what's the biblical warrant? And of course, that's what we have to reckon with. And I suppose I would divide it up as biblical principles that teach and necessarily infer the establishment principle. And then you've got direct scripture texts and teaching. So as an example of a principle, the impossibility of neutrality, that scripture teaches us that we're either for Christ or we're against him. So if you apply that then to the civil realm, to seek after religious neutrality it's a pipe dream. It's not even attainable. And so if a government were to say, we are going to be religiously neutral and we will promote principled pluralism and freedom of religion, then if we are either for Christ or against him as individuals, that also applies to social entities, to civil power. And therefore, religious neutrality as a political philosophy is fundamentally enmity against the Lord Jesus Christ. And so you can infer from biblical principles, and there are others, of course, that we can employ in that way. But then you've got so many examples of clear biblical teaching that promotes this idea. You can think of God giving his law to Israel, and in Deuteronomy chapter 4, that was to be their wisdom, not only for themselves, but as a light to the nations, so that the nations would look at them and say, well, what other nation has got such good laws? You know, the inference being all nations ought to have such wise and holy and good laws. Then Deuteronomy 17, the king in his civil office was required to have a copy of the law of God, and that he was to regularly read it and be reminded that this was the basis for the exercise of his own power. But of course, when you bring those arguments up, New Testament Christians say, but, well, that was okay, that was for Israel, and they were a particular nation, and God governed them by way of his law directly in a theocratic state. But again, when you look more closely at the Old Testament, you get various examples where it's not only Israel that were to rule by that law, but Gentile nations are judged according to it in the prophets. And then heathen kings who act in agreement with the law of God are consistently commended. So you have Nebuchadnezzar, Darius in Babylon. When you move into Ezra and Nehemiah, it comes to the fore in many practical ways, where Cyrus is commended for the Emancipation Proclamation, sending Israel back to the land, promoting the church. And then you've got Darius in chapter 6 of Ezra, Artaxerxes chapter 7, and they're commended for not only allowing Israel to go back, but actually using tax dollars to promote the rebuilding of the temple. You know, that in and of itself today it's kind of unthinkable to the American mind that tax dollars would be used for the promotion of true religion, but it's commended in the behavior of heathen kings.
Yeah.
Then you come to the Psalms and the prophets, and they're literally full of this teaching. And what's key there is that many of those Psalms and prophecies are projections of what it will be in the New Testament period. And so you can't simply say, well, it was okay for Israel in the Old Testament, but now it's the church in the New Testament among the nations. Psalm 72 clearly predicts the days of the gospel and kings coming to the Lord Jesus Christ. Psalm 86, Psalm 138, another example. But to focus in on one, Psalm 2 is very obviously somewhere that teaches this, you know, because it begins with kings and rulers, and they're taking counsel together against the Lord and against his Christ. They want to cast his government from them. God laughs, then vexes them, and sets his king upon his holy hill in Zion, and invites him to ask that the heathen may be given unto him. And at the end of the psalm, kings and rulers and judges are exhorted to be wise and to fear God with trembling, and to kiss the Son, lest he be angry with them and they perish from the way. And that can't be kings as private individuals in their closet, and not as public officials in their office. Because verse 1 and 2, they were certainly acting as public officials when they were trying to cast off the government of God. And it's in the same context that they are warned and called to submit to the king that God has set upon his holy hill in Zion. And of course, in the New Testament, we're told that referred to the rejection of Christ by Pilate and the Romans and the Jewish leaders, and it's ultimately fulfilled in his resurrection and ascension to the right hand of God. So Psalm 2 is unavoidably a picture of the requirement of civil rulers to submit to Christ. Isaiah 49. Sorry if I'm going on too much on this, but there's so much to say.
No, it's perfect.
Yeah.
The kings and queens and their nursing fathers and mothers, and Isaiah is very much, particularly when you get to 40 and beyond, it's looking beyond old covenant administration to new covenant administration, the greater exodus, and you see the coastlands being, he will not grow faint or weary until the coastlands wait for his law.
Yeah.
And the nation which will not serve you will be destroyed.
Yeah.
There's a lot is said there about people in civil power emptying their treasuries for Zion. And it's interesting, the premillennial crowd definitely sees all that as political.
Yeah.
But they see it in the future. And I find it interesting how sometimes, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit here, when I ask people what does it mean when they say, what a lot of times when I have these conversations with people in the NAPARC world, the R2K types, is that they say we need to understand the Old Testament text in light of the New Testament text and not read them as Judaizers. And so I said, what is the New Testament understanding of a king giving allegiance in their office to Christ? Like, what is the New Testament understanding of that? Like, what is it? How is it Christologically understood in a way that debunks or decreates the actual civil principle that's in that text? And I get very strange answers. One time I heard R2K guy tell me that, well, we're all kings in Christ. I was like, let me get this straight. So Isaiah talking about kings emptying their treasuries for the church is speaking about the church themselves emptying the treasures for themselves. Like, it becomes logically absurd.
Yeah.
So, and even I've been preaching through Acts, and I found something interesting in Acts. It's how Acts is very overtly yet subtly theocratic. I mean, the book is written to most excellent Theophilus, who I think that term is very clearly like to a person in civil power. Like, the whole book is written to a person in civil power. And what's intriguing to me is how people in political power are targeted throughout the whole book.
Yeah.
You have a centurion who has power over, soldiers. The first person that is converted on the way to Africa is a very high person in the Ethiopian court. The procurator is the first person that Paul is said to bring the gospel to on his missionary journey when he's sent after 13. And then the last 8 chapters, or not, like 6 chapters, something like that, there's all these conversations where Paul is bringing the gospel to people in political power, and then he gets shipwrecked, and the person that comes to faith, or is just described in like this Paul bringing something, there is the first man on the island, which also is someone who has political power on the island. And so the whole book of Luke itself, to me, is bringing the Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 4 paradigm into the new covenant. And it's fun, ironic to me too, is that there's a civil magistrate who blasphemes God, and he's just struck dead. So imagine Theophilus reading this, and he's a magistrate, and this man is a Gentile, and he blasphemes God publicly, and God strikes him dead. So much for first table of law, not really relevant to people in political power in a new covenant Gentile era. So the New Testament, but I do find it helpful that a lot of old school Reformed guys, when they're brought with the question of, there isn't a whole lot of this political talk as much as there was in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, thus implying that the New Testament is beyond like this religious view of all the spheres. And the Reform would just say, it's like, well, yeah, because God already talked about a lot, and he doesn't have to talk.
Absolutely. What he established in the old continues unless he cancels it in the new. That's a basic Reformed hermeneutic.
Yeah.
But then you get it in the new. If you actually look for it, it's there. You might have to make a few deductions, but
Mm-hmm.
take, for example, Romans 13.
Yep.
Civil magistrates are servants of God. What does that mean? They're servants of God, and they are to reward the good and punish the evil, which are moral qualities. Well, where do we get those moral qualities from? They have to be defined by God. So there's a civil ruler who's a servant of God who has to rule according to God's law. Then you get it in 1 Timothy 2. We are to pray for our civil rulers, not just that we might have a quiet life,
Godliness.
but that we might have a godly life, which again implies that the civil ruler is going to act in such a way as to establish godly laws. But then if you think even of the resurrection and ascension of Christ, who is he? He is prince over the kings of the earth. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. He is exalted far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this world, but also in that which is to come. Therefore, what is true in fact, that Christ is this, necessarily must be recognized in reality in the world. So the principle is there in the New Testament if you're reading and applying those texts correctly to their logical conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So how would you unpack the Westminster tradition in particular and the establishment principle? And how would you answer the assertion that we can separate the establishment principle from the Westminster tradition? So what is the connection with the establishment principle and the Westminster tradition particularly? And can we unhinge the establishment principle with the Westminster tradition?
Okay, I think to answer that question, you need to first go back, because the Westminster tradition does not just appear in a vacuum. It's not like this is a new tradition as something distinct from even early church history, and particularly the Reformation period. And so when you go into the 16th century confessions of faith, which were a lot shorter and more basic than the Westminster Confession, all of those Reformed confessions held to this view. So if you take the first confession, Helvetica in Switzerland, it says, seeing that every magistrate is of God, his chief duty, except it please him to exercise tyranny, consisteth in this, to defend religion from all blasphemy, to promote it, and as the prophet teacheth, out of the word of the Lord, to see that it's put in practice as far as lies within him. You get the same thing in the second Helvetical confession, which was approved by the Church of Scotland in the 16th century. It's in the confession to Bohemia, the confession of the church in Saxony. The Belgic confession, Article 36, states, with regard to the magistrate, and their office is not only to have regard unto and to watch for the welfare of the civil state, but also that they protect the sacred ministry, and thus may remove and prevent all idolatry and false worship, that the kingdom of Antichrist may thus be destroyed and the kingdom of Christ promoted. So all of these confessions prior to Westminster had this. The Scots Confession 1560 has it, the Second Book of Discipline has it. And so the Westminster tradition on this point is not distinctly Westminsterian. It's just Reformed 101.
Yeah.
I had a debate a number of years ago online with Scott Clark, and he was speaking very powerfully against the establishment principle. And I simply asked him the question, are you not the guy who's supposed to be recovering the Reformed confessions? And he said, well, yeah, I know I'm not in line with them. And I said, you're out of line with every single one of them. And he agreed. So then Westminster sits in the 1640s, and you've got chapter 23 on the civil magistrate. and the magistrate is to exercise his power that unity and peace be preserved in the church, and that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed. But it's not just that chapter. Chapter 24 on liberty of conscience requires the civil magistrate and the church to act against heresy. And of course, that builds on chapter 19, where you've got the threefold distinction of the law. And the moral law is said to be applicable not just to justified persons, but to all men. Implied there is in all of their various relations. Then you have chapter 31, paragraph 2 on synods and council, that it's the magistrate's lawful right to call synods and see that they're ordered properly. Larger Catechism 109 tells us that the sins that are forbidden in the second commandment include tolerating a false religion. So the Westminster tradition builds upon everything that is previous to it and is consistent with that. And you find this even in the early church and their understanding of the role of the civil magistrate. And maybe we'll talk more about that later. But the church was summoned by civil rulers to sit in synods to resolve doctrinal controversies. And so there's a clear understanding of the lawful right of the civil magistrate to do that. So can the Westminster tradition be separated from the establishment principle? Well, the answer is really simple: not consistently. You don't just modify a part of the confession. The confession is a coherent whole, and therefore you're necessarily affecting other aspects of it, like chapter 19 on the law. You're essentially gutting the civil use of the law. It has an implication there. I think also it's always been very interesting to me that when people separate the establishment principle out, you're asking, what are the reasons behind it? Are they exegetical? And when it was done, and much of the argumentation that I've heard, even to the present day, it's not actually upon strong exegetical grounds at all. It's usually motivated by something very different.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the Solemn League and Covenant also is very important backdrop document to the standards. First and second book of discipline, national covenant, all those things are unanimously saying the same thing. And I like how you brought out how the system of doctrine and everything is interconnected. So the establishment principle is connected to many things in the standards, including the offices of Christ, his kingship, including the section about the Lord's Prayer, where you see the question, I forget if it's 188 or 189 or 190 or 91, one of those talks about what do we pray for in the second petition. And even that is connected to our view of the magistrate, and they're interconnected. Even the Larger Catechism 99 has those 8 or 9 qualifiers to how to read the law of God. And one of them talks about how we are to obey the law of God in our places and callings.
Yep.
And those around us are also, we keep in mind our obedience to God's law in light of those who were under and those who were over. And so and then you think about that statement, the Westminster Standards presents a covenant theology, a covenantal principle for how to see Scripture. And so the way that we see the world is through this world of covenant, where there's representational figures that oversee collective groups, and the magistrate and the home and the household and the church, they're connected to these principles. And even just the talking, even in the second, I think it's the second commandment, and even the second commandment is connected to this conversation of matters, because it talks about removing monuments of idolatry, and we don't do that. Well, I guess we do in some sense, doctrinally and the discipline, but we don't. We're not those who go into society and rip down monuments of idolatry. That's the magistrate's job, and so I believe to rip this principle out of the standards is it's impossible, because you will find it throughout the entire documents. You will find it in the writings. You will find it in the minutes. You will find it in the catechisms. But somehow, I find it intriguing that many people actually believe that the adjustments that we made. Well, I don't know how the Scottish Church Continuing is, but the adjustments that we made, the OPC, the PCA, to Section 23, have somehow made us principal pluralist, and it's just even the adjusted Chapter 23, I believe, it's still very much consistent with Christendom. It's just it's reduced Christendom. It's somewhat modified Christendom, but I mean, I think the citation still is Isaiah 49, and it's interesting how in the discussion of magistrates and their roles in the adjusted standards, there's examples of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the guy beating people up. The citations is a guy beating people up for breaking the Sabbath. You just can't. I believe you can unhinge this from the standards, but I think people definitely think the adjustments make this very much a discombobulated thing. But that kind of brings me to the next vital question: like, how did we get here? How did we get from this being an undebatable normal dogma of orthodoxy in the Reformed tradition, and how is this now very controversial and very debatable? Yeah, how do we get here? I mean, obviously there's a lot, but you can cliff note us how we got there.
Yeah, well, I don't think it was exegetically, and I don't think it was biblically driven. I think it was socially driven by a number of factors. One would have been philosophical. The writings of the men of the 16th and 17th century are decidedly different on this matter than those who are on the back of what we call the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And so at that period, you've got philosophy developing in a humanistic trajectory. And then politically, you start to get those things applied. And these two things coalescing seem to have an impact upon the church, so that the church begins to assume certain things cannot be, and therefore the views of our forefathers are rejected. Now, as I said, they don't make a biblical case for that. It tends to be assumed. And you've got that really, even in Presbyterianism from the beginning in North America. You've got the First Presbytery, 1706, and they don't have an official subscription to a confession of faith. And then you get that matter raised in like 1720s, becomes a big issue. And the question of then, how do we subscribe the confession? And so the issue of exceptions arises way back in the 1720s. And one of the issues is the establishment principle. And you've got philosophy in the background, you've got politics, you've also got experience, because many of these people were Scots-Irish, Ulster Scots. Their forefathers were persecuted in the Covenanting period in Scotland. Then after the Revolution settlement, they're in Ulster, and Ulster doesn't get Presbyterianism, so they continue to be persecuted there under an Anglican establishment in the late 1600s and throughout the 1700s. So they flee and they come to America. And so their experience has given them a very negative view of the establishment principle because they suffered under the abuse of an Anglican establishment. And so it's those things that tend to drive the shift away from it. And particularly the issues of religious liberty and liberty of conscience. And the Enlightenment philosophy really shifts people's understanding of those two things. So then it's taken as a natural right, a human right, that we have religious liberty and that we have liberty of conscience, meaning we're allowed to believe and do anything as long as it doesn't violate certain norms that humanism still permits, or still outlaws. And so all of that is coalescing in America when it comes to the Revolutionary War and the establishment of the Constitution. And I don't think it's a surprise that the American Presbyterians actually modified the Westminster Confession in that immediate context, when politically the American Constitution was being drawn up. But even then it was rejected, because in North Carolina, for example, you have a minister called David Caldwell who was in Greensboro. And when the Constitution came down to be ratified by the states, he attended the convention of the North Carolina legislature in Hillsborough. And he argued against North Carolina adopting the Constitution, particularly on the basis of its views of religious toleration. And he made the case that if America were to follow that course and did not have a religious test for office, that all kinds of idolaters could sit in the highest seats of federal power. And he persuaded the men, and they rejected the Constitution. I don't think many people know that. But 6 months later, they recanted because of economic pressure. But it's an example of how Presbyterian ministers at that time, many of them still held vociferously to the establishment principle. So you've got Enlightenment philosophy and political philosophy, and then you've got weariness and bad experiences of nonconformists. But if you think about that, in Scotland in the 1700s, the Covenanters, who were nonconformists to the Anglican settlement, they are violently persecuted, and estimates as high as 18,000 of them lost their lives. But never in that did they ever abandon the establishment principle. In fact, they continually affirm it. And their argument against the illegitimacy of the Stuart kings is that they have actually violated their responsibility in relation to the establishment principle. So here they are being persecuted and dying, and yet essentially they're dying for the establishment principle while they're suffering under an abusive establishment.
Yeah, that's a few thoughts. I don't know if you were finished. So one thought is, you said that people suffered very much for the establishment principle. That was one of the things they suffered for. And I find it interesting to note that, because one of the things that I hear said is that these people that are all about some kind of theocracy, Christendom, establishment principle, and I know that conversation has very many different kinds of people in it, but just generally speaking, is it because we don't want to suffer? And when I look in church history, I'm like, the men that said that Jesus Christ is the Lord of everything and everyone in every way are the ones that suffer the most. I don't think it's as controversial and as polarizing to say, just leave us alone while we do liturgy and devotions. You know, I mean, Samuel Rutherford, he had a death threat on him for his writings.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and you even see it now. One of the things that you notice in America is that secular humanistic people are very enraged about the concept of any kind of Christian standard in public life, more than I think anything else. And so I think it's ironic that the establishment person is accused of being one who wants to avoid persecution. The other thing, as you were talking, that I thought of, and I'm let's see if you agree with me. Is it fair to say that many of the people that were anti-establishment principle were the heretics of the time? Socinians, the Libertines, the Anabaptists. They were the ones making the arguments that freedom of speech and freedom of religion is some institutional civil right, and much of the writings of a guy like Gillespie and Rutherford, free disputation of conscience, that they were actually addressing these heretical groups that were using this view of political civil life as basically reason and grounds to perpetuate their doctrines. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's absolutely true, and you could link Cromwell with that as well, because on the back of the Solemn League and Covenant, he comes into power, and he does more than many people recognize to destroy the whole Puritan project, and he promotes a false view of liberty of conscience. And so when you have Rutherford and these men writing at that time, it's relevant to the floodgates that Cromwell opened for all the sects to flourish in the United Kingdom at that time. And even the Belgic Confession, I quoted from it earlier, the following paragraph goes on, I believe it begins, and therefore we detest the errors of the Anabaptists. And so they're actually highlighted in the Belgian Confessions chapter on the civil magistrate. And that's a big question, because the Anabaptists, of course, many of them rejected the lawfulness of civil government completely, not just the establishment principle, but civil government as a thing.
Yeah. Would you say that there's a connection with the French Revolution and this view as well, or would that be just being the general Enlightenment conversation?
Yeah, so that happens. That's one of the applications of humanistic philosophy in the political realm. But George Smeaton, who writes on the establishment principle, concretely links it with the French Revolution. He says that voluntarism proposes a non-religious state, a purely secular state. And then he says, never till the dawn of the French Revolution did this principle gain much attention or influence. So he's even recognizing what's happening historically in the rise of this different view of the relationship between church and state.
Yeah, I find that interesting, because this goes back into the Enlightenment, which I think is a valid case. But I also believe a lot of these views in the present have something to do with dispensationalism. But maybe I heard I was at Southern Seminary for a season of my life, and I actually saw a professor make a correlation with the Enlightenment and dispensational interpretation of the Bible. And I found that intriguing. So basically, the idea that we don't understand the Bible as this supernatural cohesive whole, but all of these discombobulated parts, it has a connection to Enlightenment thinking. So maybe the dispensational link to this kind of view that we're talking about, or this anti-establishment view, and the Enlightenment, though they're different things, they may have some connection. Because I do think that one of the things that I encounter regularly with American evangelicals is that their dispensational view of the Bible definitely is a part of why they can't understand what we're saying about the concept of Israel in a general equity sense having weight in the New Covenant era amongst the nations. And I think a lot of it has to do with that. And when I hear a lot of Reformed people talk, they sound very similar to dispensationalists, though they would be Paedo Baptists and they would not believe in some premillennial paradigm. So I do see dispensationalism definitely have an active role in this in the present. What would I guess you would agree with that? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think where a link between the Enlightenment and dispensationalism could be seen is that the Enlightenment by default demanded the privatization of Christianity, get rid of it from the public realm. And that goes hand in hand with an emphasis in dispensationalism. Well, the world's going to hell anyway, so it's about personal devotion and your own walk with the Lord. And as you mentioned earlier, all the political stuff is projected forward into the millennial kingdom, and so not relevant for the present day. So there's maybe a connection. There.
Yeah. What would you say to? I guess this is getting I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's in my head. I just want to get it out. One of the things that I've heard in the Reform world's objection to this principle is that the Reformers, they just had excess medieval views that they didn't work out. So Calvin truly, in his heart of hearts, he was, a voluntarism person, and he was a principal player. He was there, but he was just a victim of his environment. And if we had given Calvin more time, if we had given the Reformers more time, they would have realized that their views of society, civil life, were actually Roman, or you couldn't say Church of England, Erastian, because they were very much, I don't know, that's a bit harder to say, but I guess maybe the excess of Romanism, but they were anti-Roman too. So what would you say to they were just captured and victim of their times, and they just didn't have time to work this out? What would you say to that?
Suppose I would struggle to answer it nicely. It's so historically ignorant, and it's also totally disingenuous when you read the writings of Calvin himself. So read Calvin, for example, on Isaiah 49, on that portion about kings shall be thy nursing fathers. And it's clear that he's making an exegetical case for it. Read him in the Institutes, where he has a very detailed exposition of what is required of the civil magistrate. Read Vere and his view on the civil magistrate. Read Knox as well, and how he developed his understanding of the relationship between church and state. And these men come at it from a textual basis, and they believe it to be taught in the Bible. That is beyond dispute. So people need to go back to these sources and see what these men were saying themselves. Then with regard to history, somebody like Vere, for example, he's kicked out of Lausanne because he refuses to submit to the overreach of the magistrate. He refuses to hold the Lord's Supper because he believes there's too much sin in the people, and they kick him out for that. Calvin's kicked out of Geneva because he won't obey certain dictates of the magistrate. So you got to stand back and think, why is this? Here are men who are exegetically teaching the requirement of the civil magistrate to uphold true religion, and yet they're resisting the civil magistrate. It's because they developed the right approach to what is the magistrate's role around the things of religion. So you're to promote it over against refusing the magistrate's authority when he injects it into the sphere of the church. These men in real time had to work out these principles and apply them in their lives, and you find them doing it. And you've got the full balance of the independence between the church and the state, their coordinate powers, and yet the civil magistrate is to promote true religion. So you'll not find Calvin objecting in any way to the magistrate requiring everybody goes to church, and that the church set up at 12 noon a catechism class for children and requires all of the families in the city of Geneva to send their children to that by law. He doesn't oppose that at all.
Yeah, and his argumentation for why the Servetus affair is not inappropriate is also textual, and then even John Knox defends that as well. What are some ways people misunderstand and falsely portray the establishment principle? Misunderstand and falsely portray it.
Well, I think one of the main ones is they just label it as Erastian. And when they do that, they tell you that they don't understand what Erastianism was or what the establishment principle was, because the men who codified the establishment principle in the Westminster Assembly were vehemently opposed to Erastianism. And I've just given you examples there as well. Vere opposes the magistrates. Calvin opposes the magistrates when they try to take authority in the church and not around the things of religion. And so a classic portion that they'll turn to is the chapter on synods and councils in the Westminster Confession. And they'll say, look, you see, this is Erastian because it's giving power to the magistrate to call a synod. I think it's helpful to note that when the Scottish Church adopted the Westminster Standards, that they did in their adopting act clarify what that meant. But essentially all that's doing is saying that the civil magistrate takes his responsibility to promote true religion. He cannot determine questions of faith and doctrine. That's the church's job. So what the magistrate does is tell the church to do its job. I want to promote true religion. You get on with your job, come back with a confession of faith, a directory for public worship, a form of church government. And when you do that, that's what I'll uphold.
Yep.
And, historically, that's the way we've got so many of our confessions of faith, like the Arian controversy. Well, call a synod. The church settles the question, so the magistrate knows what the true doctrine is. The Synod of Dort, there's a problem with the remonstrants and the followers of Arminius. Call a synod. Get the church to settle the question. Now, if the magistrate was the one who was settling the question and dictating to the church what the church should believe, then the church is going to reject that, which is essentially what happened in the Covenanting period. The king was trying to impose doctrine, worship, and practice upon the church. And the church said, sorry, you have no authority here. Get out. And we get the covenants as a result of that. So the establishment principle is not Erastian. George Gillespie took on Selden at the Westminster Assembly, and Selden was an Erastian, and he destroyed his arguments in opposition to it. So that's one of the kind of false portrayals of it. Then the second one would be that the establishment principle teaches persecuting principles, and therefore the denial of liberty of conscience and the suppression of idolatry is necessarily persecution. But again, that's not answering the question biblically, because liberty of conscience is still governed by God.
Yeah.
And we do not have liberty to publicly blaspheme the Lord. any more than a man whose conscience is okay with raping women can plead conscience. Well, my conscience is fine with this, and you're curtailing my liberty of conscience. It's not an argument. The magistrate should enforce law by the power of the sword against him. And so if you look at the confession, God alone is Lord of the conscience, and he has made it free from the commandments of men. He hasn't made it free from the commandments of God.
Mm-hmm.
People read it as if it says conscience is Lord over all, but it's not. God is Lord over conscience, and therefore we need to have our conscience informed and submitted to the Lord, and we do not have liberty to then go out and publicly give ourselves to idolatry and blasphemy and Sabbath desecration and all these things.
Yeah. I mean, I also think too that there's like this secular humanistic view of harm, because the secular humanists believe, you shouldn't be allowed to like butcher somebody. Well, I guess if they're a baby, you can, but you can't butcher an adult. You can't punch someone in the face, because that hurts people. But public blasphemy kills people too. Not just spiritually speaking. I mean, it leads to second table violations. I mean, worshiping Molech leads to you butchering your kids. The judgments of God are brought down by blasphemy. So we've bought into this idea that harmful is reducible to our physicality and our property, which is not a biblical concept. The third commandment does not allow for free speech to be unrestricted and unqualified, for sure. And so this is kind of related to that. Like, it's a little bit different but related. But like, so some objections are freedom of conscience. Others are it's Erastianism. Are there any other objections that you could think of? I know one objection. I see where you're going with this. You want to basically not only restrict and protect the world from paganism and Islam and all this other stuff, but you also want to jail and hurt and harm the Baptist person.
Mm-hmm.
And so what would you say that objection?
Yeah, that's a real one. I did a podcast when COVID started, and I outlined the Reformed view of the relationship between church and state, and one of the other contributors didn't like it, and he wrote 4 articles. He was a Baptist, and he said, this is the view that led to the persecution of your Baptist forefathers. So I think we have to realize that a lot of abuses have been committed in the name of the establishment principle, and that we need to think through very carefully how it would apply. And there are shades of view as to what that should be. One view is that it is one denomination that is established, and anything out with that is non-conformity and subject to the penalty of law. And another view would be, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be one denomination that's established, but the Christian religion that is to be established within certain parameters, in which, for example, certain Baptists and other people who couldn't agree with the Presbyterian church government or whatever could still function with liberty and not come under the sanction of law. So the principle itself does not tell us exactly how the principle is to be applied.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't appeal to abuses of the principle to reject the principle itself. It just requires us to think through, okay, how ought this to be applied? A denomination or the Christian faith over against false religions, which would include certain false expressions of Christianity as well, such as Roman Catholicism. So an abuse of the principle is not an argument against the principle itself. Otherwise, we could argue, that the headship of a husband should be rejected because some husbands are terrible heads and they abuse their wives. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, it's a good answer. How about this one? Well, what happened to Scotland? What happened to Ireland and England? And what happened to Geneva? Everyone, what happened to all these countries that had some kind of establishment principle that was Christian? Look at them now. It's like communism. Everyone thinks that they can figure out communism, and they're the generation that could figure it out that others couldn't figure it out. And so it's very clear, apparently, that this theocratic Christendom, biblical paradigm of Christianity, it doesn't work. Look around. How would you respond to that? I mean, that's the easiest one to respond to, but I find that one to be such a compelling thing that people listen to.
I would answer it in three ways. First of all, like I answered the last one, the failure of a principle's application is no argument against the lawfulness of the principle. So if it has failed, you can't say, oh, look at that, it failed, therefore it cannot be true. The second thing that I would say is that the Enlightenment happened and the church corrupted itself and ceased to perform its duty to the civil magistrate and to instruct the people in this. In fact, in the 18th century in Scotland, moderatism to a large extent became dead religion that was deistic and governed more by humanistic thought than it was the Bible. So throughout the 18th century, you've got the majority of Scotland being taught a version of humanistic philosophy. And so the nation is crumbling as that advances in the political realm, and then the church is taking its own axe and chopping its own tree down. So there are reasons that you can see as to why that happened. But I also think that an argument can be made from the state of Scotland today, because it's terrible. The churches are so small, the country is secular, it's the most progressive part of the United Kingdom, it's got the worst government, it's in the vanguard of promoting every immorality that you could imagine. And so people come and say, well, look, there's the nation that was all for the establishment principle. And I would say, yes, look, indeed, it rejected it. And to whom much is given, much shall be required. And the Lord has brought the hammer down, just like he did with Israel. When Israel had so much, you could take the same argument and say, well, it doesn't work because look at Israel. But are we going to say that God didn't command Israel to be governed according to biblical law? And when they refused, when they had so much and then rejected it, that he dealt with them so harshly?
Yeah, that's a good point you bring up too, because I've heard this many times by the Reformed Baptist. And by the way, I personally believe that Baptist perspectives are they're not they cannot coexist with what we're talking about. Independent church government, no outward administration of grace and religion. Those views are, when you try to make some kind of Christendom and Christian nationalism thing with Baptist principles, I feel like it doesn't work. As a matter of fact, I see a connection in America with the decline of more theocratic views with their predominance of.
Yeah, it's not essential. It's not essential to Baptist theology. The Baptists, if you look at their main distinctives, it's to do with church government and the administration of the sacraments. And some of that is tied. They lose a collective mindset there, and things tend to become more individualistic. So covenant home disappears. Church membership is, regenerate church membership. But at the same time, there were many Baptists in the 17th century, and there are some I know today who actually do believe in the establishment principle. Now, they wouldn't be looking for a denomination to be established, but they would agree with the establishment of Christianity and the rejection of idolatry and heresy and false religion from the land. So it's not essential to their view, but I think, yes, as Baptist theology developed, it has naturally led to the increase of the voluntary principle.
If I were to try to find a historic Reformed Baptist who was arguing for the establishment principle, who would I look for?
I think it would be good to trace the development from Westminster through Savoy to the 1689 or the 1677-89 Baptists, because take, for example, the Savoy Declaration differs from Westminster on the principle of church government. So it's not Presbyterian, it believes in independency. But yet the Savoy Declaration still holds to the establishment principle. And you've got men like Goodwin who hold the establishment principle. John Owen teaches a form of the establishment principle, and it's debated as to what was he? Was he Presbyterian? Was he Baptist? And so, okay, I don't agree with the Baptist assessment on that, but suppose I were to concede and give the Baptists John Owen, which I don't. Well, there you go. He's teaching the establishment principle, and you're wanting to claim him.
Yeah. A lot of times when we talk about establishment, the theonomist comes up, and we get lumped into the theonomist crowd. Now, obviously, that's a huge conversation, but how would you succinctly separate theonomy from what we're talking about?
How long have you got?
I got time.
It's a big issue. So, right, theonomy as a term means the rule of God's law. So I am a theonomist. The Reformers were theonomists. But of course, when we use the term today, we refer to a 20th century view associated with Christian Reconstructionism. I am of the opinion, but I can't prove it by hard fact, that I don't think this would have existed if the church in America had not rejected the Westminster Confession. But because it did, and there was so much confusion about the role of the civil magistrate, that those who were wrestling with this question in the 20th century, they stepped into the vacuum and gave us what we know as the
just for the record, I absolutely agree with you. I think the Reformed tradition abandoning their roots has left this huge vacuum for Federal Vision, Peter Lightheart, Moscow, all the theonomist circus. I feel like that vacuum was a issue that was wrongfully filled by these people. So, anyways, just thought there.
Yeah. So where I would differ from 20th century theonomy is in their view of law. And again, this is a huge question. They're not all consistent. And so for your hearers, if they want to immediately object to this, understand I'm speaking in generalities. They tend to deny the threefold division of the law. And they collapse it into two divisions, ceremonial and moral. And they link the moral and civil laws. Then they teach a regulative principle of civil government. I believe in the regulative principle of worship. But they teach a regulative principle of civil government, which means that civil laws should be largely limited to the case laws. 600 and I can't remember the number, 30-something case laws that were given to Israel. And therefore, it's unlawful for the civil magistrate to go beyond that. He's abusing his power because he's limited by these case laws. The older view of theonomy was not that. It had a threefold division of the law, and the whole law, moral law, 10 Commandments, was to be applied by the civil magistrate. And it wasn't working upon the same principle of limited civil government. So many of the things that the reformers would have seen as legitimate applications of law to society, the modern theonomists would probably just say, well, that was socialist. Okay. That's the civil magistrate going too far. I would also say that the movement it tried to put law at the center and the application of law as it pertained to biblical worldview. It becomes politically driven, social action, application of the word to society, not so big upon the preaching of the gospel and evangelism and experiential religion. There's another place where it completely differs from the view of law from our forefathers. They believed that it was to be applied to the state. The state was to be Christian. But read Rutherford. He's gospel-centered. He's preaching Christ. He's full of personal piety. The theonomic movement, in my assessment of it, is practically void of that. Another strange thing about them is that they're very weak in the first table.
Yep.
And so it becomes the application of the second table of the law, and many of them are statedly opposed to the establishment principle. And they're very attracted to libertarianism, which I don't understand, because that's just another form of godlessness. You can have totalitarian godlessness, you can have libertarian godlessness. And as an incomer to the USA, might I be able to say it's all very American. This idea of limited civil government. These guys were big Ronald Reagan guys in the 80s and writing a lot of stuff on the economy. They love Ron Paul and, Rothbard and these guys. So it's a very, very strange mix, but it's very different to the establishment principle and the older view of the application of the law.
Yeah. I digged into a lot of those guys, Gary North, Rushdoony, and others that I can't think of right now. And I noticed the second commandment with images out the window, Sabbath out the window.
Yep.
And they're very cool with apostate Christianity as well. The Rome, and the Greek Orthodox, and all the people that didn't play very nice with the reformers. They're fine with it. They're fine with like this generic Christianity that involves the Roman Catholic world and the Protestant world, and even some guys I feel like they're okay with some of the cults as well. Just as far as like you're in the very broad Christendom conversation. And you could see that with CREC. It's very sociologically broad. A lot of them are mono-covenantalists.
Yeah.
Rushdoony was great at Judaizing New Covenant Christianity, in the sense that he would even see the tribal and ethnic distinctions of the Old Covenant as having a part of the continuation of the covenant of grace.
Yeah.
And so, very, very strange, but you're right. It steps into a vacuum that we have created, and we should hold responsibility for. All right. So here is, I guess, where I would land the plane with these two questions. Do you believe that somebody could be hearing this and say, I absolutely think everything you're saying is unbiblical and I don't hold to it, but that's just your view? Do you think that someone could hold to that view and not be ethically compromised in some way? Do you believe that someone could just totally flat out deny what we're saying and not be ethically affected? does this ethic affect other ethics? Number one. And number two, go ahead.
Well, it's kind of yes, no answer. So in terms of if he believes in the application of the law to his own life and the upholding of both tables of the law to his own life, then he's not going to be immediately ethically compromised if he doesn't think that the magistrate is to uphold that law. But at the same time, he cannot hold that view and not be indirectly affected by it. Because if you want to talk about ethics and morality, it's immoral to have false doctrine. You know, the law forbids us to have false doctrine. So he's compromised at that point where he's believing a lie and he's failing to see the application of law to society, which is ultimately for the honor and glory of the Lord. And so he's not giving the glory unto the Lord that is due unto his name. So his own personal life might not look ethically compromised, and I wouldn't suggest that he's not seeking to apply the law to himself. But indirectly, I don't think that it can be avoided. We're not giving Christ his place as Prince of the Kings of the earth. We're not seeing the full implication of the gospel and the ascended Christ being given the nations. And so your gospel is truncated in its application as well.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned earlier detesting and opposing all false religion in our places. And so that's what I've noticed is that not holding to these views is oftentimes tied to some place on the ground in real life where we have some rationalization for a very less than biblical ethic, whether it's in the political sense, even in the vocational sense, or even in the church. Like whenever like this woke stuff comes in, the answer a lot of times with wokeism and all the ideologies is, well, we just preach the gospel. We don't preach about civil and politics and economics and whatnot, and so we're just means of grace people. So a lot of times what I've noticed is that you are not shaping and forming people's comprehensive real life views of God in real life.
Yeah.
And now all these weird political things, all these strange ideologies are all over the church and even in the reform world. Like all this progressive stuff is very much in the PCA. And I think part of it is related to is you have reduced the Christian conversation to redemptive, historical, and a Christological sense.
Yeah.
And it's related to like this, what you said earlier I thought was good. When I read all the Reformed historically, they have a theology for everything. It's funny because Keller has this way of understanding like the Reformed tribe, and it's like the doctrinalist, the pietist, and the transformationalist. And when I read like the guys that we're talking about, they were all doctrinalists.
Absolutely.
They were all pietists.
Yeah.
And they were all transformationalists, and and those three things were connected.
You take Samuel Rutherford. He writes Lex Rex, which is a book of political philosophy directed by biblical principles. He writes a treatise against antinomianism, for doctrinal. He writes on covenant theology. And then he writes his letters. And if you were to put, it's interesting, the way people do textual criticism and try to find out who's the author. Well, this can't be Paul because he writes in a different way here.
Yeah.
If I were to give you Lex Rex and the letters of Samuel Rutherford and didn't tell you anything about them, you wouldn't believe they were written by the same guy. But he was the same guy, doing exactly what you described. They were holistic as believers. And going back to what you mentioned there, that ethical aspect, you're going to be compromised if you think it's all right to tolerate a false religion. And then don't be surprised if that first table sin then moves into second table sin. So you're going to tolerate homosexuality, and you're not going to want to offend anybody, and you want to start affirming things that God has said are sinful. So there are ethical consequences, and when the first domino falls, things get set in motion.
Yeah, and we've seen that. I'm reading this book by Ian Murray where he's tracing the subscription conversation, and it's funny that I could be reading it wrong and not remembering because it's a lot of detail in there. Have you read that book about Ian Hamilton wrote about the decline of subscription?
Okay, I have it. I haven't read it. Okay. The Erosion of Orthodoxy.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the first things to go in subscription was the establishment principle. That's one of the first things that was agreed to be dropped. You don't have to hold to that one. So
and the Antichrist. Those were the two main ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's intriguing to me that those things go first before other things go first. I don't think it's purely arbitrary or coincidental. So here's the last question. I could talk to you all day. You are very interesting and have a lot to say. So hopefully we can do this again sometime different for a different occasion. But there's only so far we can go today. We'll end here. If someone is hearing us and they're like, "Hey, I agree with you guys. You're right." What should they do? Like, what should they do and what should they not do? And I remember in your talk, you said one of your cautions was to not make too much of the establishment principle. So yeah, like someone hears this. I have young guys in my church who read a lot of the Scottish tradition, and they're very passionate about this thing. But yeah, what would be your advice to someone who is living right now in America at this time? Like, how do they practically? Now, I know it's a huge comment, it's a huge conversation, but how would they respond to this and do something practically? Now, I have an answer for this that I give people, but I'm really curious to hear yours.
Yeah, there's so many parts to it. I think I would root everything in piety. That there's a great motivation for young men to study things for intellectual reasons, to form convictions. And this is an area, a bit like theonomy, where we can study the past and the writers of the reformers divorced from hard piety. So let's even take an example of, your question with regard to ethics. We're really talking about the first and greatest commandment, getting first things first. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind. Then love thy neighbor as thyself. And that has its own impact in ethics. If we don't recognize that the magistrate should uphold the first table, the second table is going to go. Priorities are all wrong. And Christians will think abortion is worse than idolatry, where this teaches us actually idolatry is worse than abortion. Why? Because this principle makes us bow absolutely before the Lord, and it's rooted in love to him. So you cannot properly study and benefit from the establishment principle without doing it in a context of devotion to the Lord. That's key. And because these things don't affect me personally, I can develop a political theory and I can be right on the doctrine of the relationship between church and state, but it doesn't demand anything off me sitting here in my study. And that's as a result, that's easy study. So we must always harness it for personal piety and seek a response of a devoted heart, get our heart in tune with the sovereignty of God, the propriety of his law, and the glory of Christ in it. So that's key. The second thing I would say is it's very important to study because we have been given this as a confessional heritage and it needs to be preserved. And although we might be miles away from seeing the establishment of religion in our nation, Christians need to preserve a confessional heritage so that they know what is to be done when God in his kindness brings us to a point where it can be done. The third thing I would say is always understand that the establishment comes into effect from the ground up. So yes, the civil magistrate can become a Christian and seek to apply this. But we live in a democracy, republic, and think of the way Congress works and Senate works. It's very difficult for one man to do anything. So the establishment principle comes about organically through the revival of the church, by the preaching of the gospel, through the conversion of sinners, with that a corresponding delight in righteousness, the election of men who are in agreement with that, and the reformation of the nation according to God's law. Monarchy can actually bring establishment a lot quicker than the modern systems of government, because if the king's converted or moved, like Josiah, he immediately takes action and the nation follows. So the core has to be the gospel, and we can't be going around preaching about the establishment principle, or like the theonomists, or even now the new fad, Christian nationalism, and everybody's got a view on Christian nationalism. And you're like, you know, this can have its place, but it's also a complete distraction.
Yeah. The Great Commission does not go into the world and preach the establishment principle.
Yeah.
Though the establishment principle is very much a part of the Great Commission. I think that's the teaching them to obey all I've commanded them.
Yes.
Right. But yeah, I was reading with my kids this morning, 1 Timothy 2, and it's like, notice how Paul speaks about the universal call to preach the gospel to all people, but then he particularly discusses the need to pray for a certain kind of person in magisterial power. And his reason for the conversion of that person is, number one, he talks about the benefit for the church and their life and their piety. But number two, because there's one mediator between God and man, right? Man, Christ Jesus, who gave himself a ransom for all. For this, I was appointed, a witness, and this is why I teach. And so he discusses conversion and the conversion of a magistrate in light of the supremacy of God's redemptive purposes through Christ. And so the supremacy of Christianity in the civil sphere is not the supremacy by which you march and you move forward, right? It's the supremacy of Christ himself, the Father, and the Spirit glorified in their triune redemption that is the epicenter by which you then work out these conversations. And it sounds like you're nitpicking, but it can get you to very different places, right? And that's why I believe that the counter of the R2K kind of person, the more pietistic person, I think it's very compelling to be stated, because you hear these people that are seeing this, especially in the Christian nationalist conversation. They're seeing all these people that are reducing Christianity to the civil sphere and institutions, and in a very overpronounced sense. And then you got these, R2K type of people. You don't have to be R2K. The R2K is just the kind of evangelicalism in the water in many traditions. And they talk about, we're about the supremacy of Christ and the glory of heaven. And it's like, yeah, but I find the establishment conversation, the Christendom conversation, in its unhealthy sense that we're countering at the end of this, it does give credence, I believe, wrongly so, to the over spiritualization of things. and evangelicalism in general. And so I think what I tell people, I says, it takes a whole Bible to make a whole Christian, and it takes the whole Reformed tradition with the whole Bible to make the whole Christian. So step number one, catechize your children to the whole counsel of God, including the establishment principle. Catechize your church to this.
Yeah.
And maybe our kids will have a true Christianity that is comprehensive and more reflective of the that will lead to actual establishment. But that, I mean, so I'm not like it's so far away, do nothing. I'm also not like it's right there for us to take. I do think that you have to make godly families and godly churches
Absolutely.
that make godly presbyteries that then will trickle into. But we Americans, we're so discipled by post World War II life where everything has an immediate solution, everything is quick and everything is fast.
Yeah.
And it's just not going to be the case. So I think that at the end of the day, we're going to look more like not establishment people in this generation, though we very much could be establishment principle in this generation.
But one practical thing that we can do, though, is recognize that the establishment principle means that the church has a prophetic voice to the state,
yes,
whether or not the state listens.
Absolutely.
So, locally in your city council, locally in your county government, your state government, the church should be raising its voice, letter writing, attending meetings if wicked things are going to be introduced. And ministers of the gospel should be standing up and saying, this is unbiblical, this is contrary to the moral law of God, calling them to repentance and warning them of judgment. So we can do that, and we're not responsible for the consequences of that. They belong to the Lord, but it's something that we can do. But, going back to what you were saying, and I'll finish with this, it's not either or with regard to spiritual life and heaven and glory over against a view of a Christian nation. It's both and.
Yeah.
And we tend to run to extremes in one way or another. But I believe firmly in the establishment principle. I pray for it to come to pass, and we ought to pray. I see it as a gospel issue, in that this is the fruit of the redemption of Christ, that the nations will come to him and acknowledge him to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and that fuels prayer. This is a desire for the glory of the King. Let the crown flourish upon the head of my Messiah. But at the same time, I'm living for another world.
Yes.
The emphasis of the Bible is Old Testament, New Testament. We're living for another world. Abraham looked to Canaan and through Canaan to a city that had foundation, whose builder and maker is God. And that's where something like the Larger Catechism 191 brings all these things together. The advance of the kingdom in my heart, the destruction of the kingdom of Satan, the establishment of the church with all gospel officers, that she might be countenanced and maintained by the civil magistrate, but ultimately that the kingdom of grace would give way to the kingdom of glory.
Yeah.
It's the whole picture that has to be our piety and our drive.
Absolutely. Very, very well said. Thanks a lot for your time. And this is very helpful. I feel like this is one of the more important conversations of our day. Obviously, there's many, but it's one of them for sure. I feel like the law of God this is a bigger conversation of the law of God in some ways. I feel like that is a huge thing now, and it's funny because I've been reading a lot of books on the assembly and the men of the assembly. I didn't realize how it's arguably debatable that antinomianism is the great concern of the assembly.
True.
And here we are, much centuries later, and the law of God in the Reformed Church, I believe, is under many kinds of assault, and it shows up in certain places. I feel like here it's showing up. You see it with the sexuality conversation. You see it with the gender conversation and roles of men and women, and here you see it with the magistrate conversation. So very important. Thanks again for your time. Kingdom Polemics. Let us know what you think about the ongoing conversation about the establishment principle. Remember, we're going to have questions answered as a segment. We'll take your questions about things, follow-up questions, and that'll be something that I do specifically. So, all that said, Kingdom Polemics signing off. Till the next time.